So I'm here downstairs in my living room, which is also my main listening space, as opposed to being upstairs in my office, which is where I filmed my last couple of reviews. And the reason is that I'm reviewing this thing, the Willsenton R800i. It weighs 42 kilograms. Now that has to be close to 100 pounds. And it's proved a couple of things. The first thing is that my days of lifting anything approaching my body weight are well and truly behind me. This is about as heavy as I'm prepared to go these days. And the second thing is that I busted my knee at the weekend, so there's no way that I'm lugging that thing up 2 stories. And before I feel too sorry for myself or allow you to express too much sympathy, I should point out that it was totally self-inflicted. And yes, I was inebriated at the time. Anyway, on to the business at hand. In many ways, the R800i could be considered the big brother of the immensely popular R800. It is certainly bigger and substantially heavier, but it's also a significantly different design. Here we have 48 watts of pure single-ended Class A power. There are 2 versions of the R800i that you can purchase directly from the China Hifi website. The one that I've got runs the 805A output tubes, and that's why it produces 48 watts of power. It's recommended for use with speakers that are low and medium sensitivity. So if the sensitivity of your speakers is below 90 dBs, it's the one that I'd suggest that you go for. There is another version that runs 845 output tubes and produces less power at 23 watts. Presumably what you're doing is trading some of that output power for a lower noise floor, and that makes it more appropriate to use with higher sensitivity speakers, something in the 90 dB plus range. If you think you can simply switch out the 805As for the 845s if later down the line you change your mind, that simply isn't the case. Each amplifier is specifically designed to run those set of tubes. Both versions currently retail for around $2,000 on the China Hifi website. That makes them over double the price of the Willsenton R8. Of course, you need to convert into your currency and account for shipping, taxes and import duties. By the time you've done all of that, I think the R800i is likely to cost around £2,500 delivered to your door in the UK, whereas the R8, well, that's likely to be a little bit over £1,000. I'm talking about both versions with standard tubes. There are tube upgrade options available for both of these amplifiers. So the question I really wanted to know was, is it worth the extra? I'll just take you through the front controls. There's a knob to turn the unit on. It takes a little time for the tubes to heat up, and then a little relay clicks, lets you know that the amplifier is ready to go. The first toggle switch is for bias current adjustment, and the VU meter also doubles up as a bias meter. I'll talk about both of these in a little bit more detail in the setup section. You can turn off the lights to the VU meter, which you may prefer. I do. I'm not a big fan of the blue LEDs, but you may prefer them. I'd have liked orange because I think that would have been more in keeping with a vintage design. That little click that you just heard, that's the amplifier letting you know that it's ready. And over here you have 5 inputs labelled A, B, C, D and E. There's no input display, so you just have to remember what's connected to whichever input that you're using. The volume is from Alps. It has a very nice feel to it, smooth with good resistance, and everything on this amplifier is superbly well constructed. There's no plastic, the metal is very heavy gauge, it's nicely finished. Even the supplied remote control may be simple, but it's an all metal affair. On the rear you'll see 3 conventional RCA inputs, an XLR balanced input, and input E is actually a pre-input, which means that you can run this as a power amp. I wouldn't connect your sources directly to that input unless they've got a volume control. Otherwise you're going to get the full force of this amplifier delivered to your speakers. There are very good speaker binding posts with taps at 4, 8 and 16 ohms. Now whatever the official rating of your speaker, I'd actually play around with those taps and see which one sounds best. It may not be the one that coincides with the official rating of your speaker. There are various different types of tubes here, 6 which are directly in the signal path and 2 which aren't. So let's talk about the 2 which aren't first. This tube here in the middle is a 274B. Its job is rectification, to convert the incoming AC mains into DC. In front of it is a little 12AX7 tube. I think its job is a mixer tube. It deals with the left-right channels. You've got 3 stages of amplification, and these are the tubes that are in the signal path. The pre-amplifier stage, which runs 6 SN7s, that's a dual triode tube. It then hands over to the 300B, which is a triode tube, for the driver stage, and the final stage of amplification, the output stage, runs 805As, which is also a triode tube. You might be getting as much as 500 volts off this tube, so that then has to be brought down to a sensible voltage for safety reasons, and also you need current as opposed to voltage to drive speakers and low impedance, and the job of that is this output transformer here, and it's an IE type of construction transformer. The big transformer in the middle, that's for the power supply, and I believe it is a toroidal transformer in this particular case. It's encased for cosmetic reasons and also to reduce noise. And you've got identical tubes on the other side for the other amplification stage as well. So let me start by asking you, what type of sound would you typically associate with a Class A amplifier? I know what I'd expect, a warm tonal balance by virtue of a full harmonically rich mid-range and no hint of electronic glare in that region, the kind of sound that you could listen to all day without any chance of listening fatigue. Well, that's exactly what you get with the R800i. It's very Sugden-esque in its sonic character. In fact, it reminds me a lot of the A21 signature that I reviewed some time ago, but the R800i has a lot more power. In fact, even the Sugden IA4, which retails here in the UK for just over £6,000, only produces 33 watts of Class A power, makes the R800i seem a bit of a bargain from that perspective. The bass is also what I'd come to expect from a good Class A amplifier. Weighty, authoritative, but not the last word in definition. I think rock enthusiasts will wind up looking elsewhere. It's not going to be able to deliver those fast percussive transients in the way that they'd like. But with other genres of music, I think it'll have you smiling with the extra dynamic impact that it imparts. I've already mentioned the harmonic richness in the mid-range and the lack of electronic glare. If that's your thing, you're no longer going to be smiling listening to the R800i, but grinning from ear to ear. But it isn't the last word in clarity and revealing detail. The leading edges of notes are softened slightly, and the decays, I would like them to be realised a little bit more fully. That ability to stop and start not quite so quickly is perhaps the reason why it doesn't image quite so precisely. It's not bad in this regard, solid 8 out of 10, but certainly not class leading. The high frequencies are also slightly recessed, yet again falling into the good rather than the great category. They're no worse than they are on the Willsenton R8, but there's a lot more going on in the mid-range of this amplifier, so your attention is automatically drawn more towards that area. I would like to see, just for the sake of balance, a little bit more expression on top, whether it be the upper harmonics of vocals, instruments, or the hit and decay of cymbals. Then there's the soundstage. It's huge, I mean massive. It extends way beyond the speakers left and right and has immense soundstage depth, as long as it's there in the recording, of course. The only solid state amplifier that's come close to it that I've reviewed or had in my home is my own Exposure 21 Pre and 18 Super monoblocks, but I'd say the R800i is a touch wider and deeper still. And then there's the instrument separation. I know I said earlier that the imaging isn't locked down precise, but the ability to actually track individual instruments within the mix, that's very good. You're going to find nothing to complain about there. So let's talk about those comparisons. The R8 in standard form is a great amplifier for £1,000, but it's out of its depth here. The R800i is better in all regards. It's a bit like a boy trying to play a man's game. When you upgrade to the PS Vane T Mark II collection tubes, things get a little bit more interesting. The R8's actually a match in terms of clarity, and I'd argue that it has the more even tonal balance, but in terms of dynamics, sense of scale, and harmonic richness, there's still no comparison. The Hagel H190 is likely to set you back a similar price as the R800i. It has greater clarity by virtue of a more extended top end and tighter control in the bottom end, but it also plays things more safe. The R800i has that thumping bass line, that colossal soundstage, and that acoustic mass in the mid-range that I've been talking about. Back to my exposure 21 pre and 18 super monoblocks that I mentioned earlier. Yes, in terms of scale, I'll give the edge to the valve amplifier, but only just. Tonally, they add a little bit of harmonic richness, but they don't go as far as the R800i in this regard. But it's the blackness of the background, and in that background, the ability to pick out little fine details, little nuances in the mid-range, little textures and decays that really distinguishes the exposure from all the other amplifiers I've mentioned here. For that matter, from every amplifier I've reviewed to this date on this channel. It's amazing that almost 3 years of doing this, nothing quite manages to match them in that regard. There are a few things to consider if you haven't had a tube amplifier before or a Class A amplifier before. The lifespan of tubes, well, you'd expect a minimum of 1,000 hours of use, maybe up to about 10,000 hours of use, depending on the design of amplifier and the application of the tube within the amplifier itself. I can't speak how long these will last because obviously I haven't had the amplifier long enough, but I'd expect the power output tubes, the 805As, to go first before the ones in the preamplifier stage. They typically tend to get driven harder. And replacing them doesn't have to cost fortunes. Of course, you can spend thousands. But even if you upgraded on the China Hifi website to the PS Vane T Mark II collection tubes, a pair of 6 SN7s for the preamplifier stage, a pair of 300Bs for the driver stage, a pair of 805As for the output stage, plus one 274B for rectification, would set you back around $700. Living with tubes isn't really that difficult. The only thing you need to do every couple of months is to check the bias on the main two output tubes. All the other tubes do not have an adjustment, presumably because they're fixed bias. You do that by switching the meter into bias meter mode, pressing and holding the adjacent bias current switch in either the V1 or the V2 position. Then look for the corresponding bias adjustment on the top plate of the R800i. Place a flathead screwdriver in it and turn it until you see the needle on the meter in the 0 position. Repeat the process for the second output tube. This is a Class A amplifier, so those tubes, especially the driving stage and output stage tubes, run pretty hot. You certainly wouldn't want to be in contact with them. And if you've got children running around, that's when using the supplied cage becomes a necessity. The heat generated means that you need to keep it well ventilated, and if you're in a small space that tends to get pretty warm anyway, this amplifier, like any Class A amplifier, isn't a suitable choice for you. It's not particularly fussy about the speakers that you partner with it, although it will impart its own sonic character on your system. It drove my Proax without any problem, and they made for a nice sonic pairing. The Dali Minuet SEs have excellent mid-range clarity, and all the virtues of that speaker combine with the strengths of the R800i to make a very satisfying combination. The Sound Artist LS35As aren't as revealing as the Dalis, but they're tonally richer and they have that something special in the vocal region that you get from the original LS35A. That's a warm, rich sounding speaker combined with a warm, rich sounding amplifier. Normally, that doesn't work at all. You get too much of a good thing, some kind of mushy sound. But that wasn't the case here. In fact, I don't think I've ever heard the Sound Artist LS35As sound as warm and rich, but also so full and lively as with this particular amplifier. Talking about lively, the JBL 4309 certainly have that character, but that doesn't mean they're bright. They're the most refined, balanced horn speaker that I've reviewed to date. Perhaps life-likeness is a better descriptive. I happen to be listening to that combination on Monday. That's Monday the 19th of September 2022, the day of Queen Elizabeth's state funeral. Now, I'm not one for making political statements on this channel. I like to keep as broad a church as possible, respectful of everybody's opinion, as long as they're respectful of each other, of course. But I will say this, you don't have to be British or a monarchist to appreciate that lady's dedication to public service. So on that particular day, during the service at Westminster Abbey, there was a lot of choral music, as well as bagpipes and pipe organs playing. Not only the instruments and the vocals, but the acoustics, the environment in which it was played in came through loud and clear. It was more than engaging. Given the circumstances, it was quite emotional as well. There's something special about tubes and horns when they're done right, and this combination certainly had that. The Willsenton R800i running 805A output tubes is a 48 watt per channel, single-ended pure Class A amplifier. If your ears prick up when you hear that, the likelihood is that you'll get all that you could expect and desire from this amplifier at around £2,500. Yet, I fear that I've only just started to scratch the surface of its performance envelope. With stock tubes and in standard form, I'd like to see a little bit more focus and detail, tighter bass, crisper transients in the mid-range, more prominent decays, as well as a little bit more extension on top. But this is where tube rolling can be a lot of fun. That's exactly what I got from the Willsenton R8 when I upgraded the tubes to the PS Vane T2 collection. I'm sure it will be a similar case here. But I have to judge it in its current form, and that's the reason why it misses out on the top slot, but only just. This is a big, dynamic, full, rich sounding amplifier with immense potential for future refinement. It comfortably and very easily gets a highly recommended from this channel. My question for today is, what's your experiences or thoughts about certain topologies of amplifier? Now, I'm not generally a fan of painting in broad strokes like this. For example, I think Class AB amplifiers can sound wildly different from each other, but it's also true that you associate certain characteristics with certain topologies when you're generalizing. And it's about those thoughts and experience that I'd like to hear in the comments section. All that remains for me to say is, if you like this video, you like what I'm doing with this channel, you want to see it grow, and you haven't done so already, please do all that social media stuff. Check me out on Patreon for consultancy services, bonus content, as well as the ABA club meetings that we have via video call periodically. But for today, for now, a British Audiophile, signing off.